morning. Thank you for having me back. I obviously wasn't too controversial last time. I'm not sure whether to be disappointed by that or not. So the passage I brought to you this morning is from a part of the Bible that we don't spend a lot of time in. Thank you, Joshua, for setting the scene. But let me just, if I can make the clicker work, let me just try and put this into the context of the Bible as a whole. And I'm going to say something, take this opportunity to say something that isn't strictly related to Nehemiah, but it's something that I was embarrassingly old before I realized. And a little younger than I am now, but still embarrassingly old, having grown up in church. And it's this: the books of the Old Testament and the books of the Bible in general are not in chronological order. Nobody told me that when I was growing up, and it didn't make any sense to me, and I couldn't work it out. These are the first 17 books of the Bible, and these are basically in order. The events in these books basically take place in order. Some of them overlap. Joshua said earlier, Ezra and Nehemiah used to be one book, and that's the reason why Esther's at the end. Actually, the events of Esther take place in between those two, for example. But broadly speaking, these are in order. If you read through those, you're going to see all of the events taking place in historical order. And this takes us all the way from creation through to about 400 BC, give or take. And that's the whole time period that's covered by the Old Testament. The next 5 books on here, we're cutting off at the bottom, but there are 5, I promise. Proverbs is kind of hidden. The next 5 books on there are what they call the wisdom books. So some of them do describe events, but it doesn't really matter when those events take place. It's timeless. It's wisdom. It's something for us to learn, but it's not the history of God's people. It's not on that timeline. Where it gets complicated is those books that I've shaded in red. They are the prophets, those 17 books. And there is a lot of history that takes place in those books, and every single one of them takes place during the timeline of those first 17 books in white. They don't come after. Again, blindingly obvious to a lot of you, but I guarantee you're within 10 feet of somebody who didn't know this until this morning, or it hasn't clicked for them. So again, Joshua mentioned Ezra and the rebuilding of the temple. This is a great example. There are 2 books in the Old Testament that talk about the rebuilding of the temple in great detail in terms of the history. One is Ezra, and the other one is Haggai. They're nowhere close to each other in the order of the books. It's just the way that it's worked. So the reason why I wanted to tell you that is because we're looking at Nehemiah this morning. Nehemiah, you can see there, not even in the middle of the Old Testament, but it is the end of that timeline. When we talked about that timeline from creation through to about 400 BC, Nehemiah is right at the end. Nothing that happens in the Old Testament happens after Nehemiah. And we're in the restoration period. We're rebuilding. We're rebuilding. That story, that timeline, would show us God bringing his people out of Egypt, bringing them into the promised land, giving them the promised land, settling them there. And then it would show us them making a total mess of it. It would show us God's people over and over again turning their backs on God. And so in the end, it would show us 2 nations invading, God sending 2 nations to invade. The Assyrians in the north, and then the Babylonian Empire came and invaded in the south. When the Babylonians left, they took people with them. We call that the exile. They're taken away. God's people are living outside of the land. They're in exile. And then, yes, as Joshua mentioned already, they come back. They start to come back. It's a trickle, but they start to come back. They start to rebuild. We see that in Ezra, and we see that again in Nehemiah. And that's where we leave the story for 400 years, give or take, until Jesus comes along. So, who is Nehemiah? Well, he's a civil servant. He's a high-ranking servant of King Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes is the ruler of the Persian Empire. That's the sort of local superpower at the time. So we're in about 450 BC, something along those lines. Right at the start of the book, we see that Nehemiah wants to go back to Jerusalem, and he wants to rebuild it. And specifically, as we've seen, he wants to rebuild the city walls. Those walls have been in ruins for 50 to 100 years, give or take, depending on which of the invasions knocked them down. And even though some people have returned to live in Jerusalem, they're living there at the start of this book with holes in the wall and with no city gates. And that's a big problem. It's hard for us because we think of cities as having more crime. We think of cities as having more violence. But during this period, it was the other way round. During this period, the country was where the lawlessness was. And the city wall was how you kept that lawlessness outside. It wasn't just about invading armies, although it was that too. You could shut the gate at night time, which would keep the raiders away. You could post a guard at the gates who could make sure that the people who were coming into your city were the kind of people you wanted there. So without a wall, there was a real safety issue. You didn't want to live in Jerusalem, it wasn't safe. But actually more than that, without a wall, Jerusalem didn't feel like a city at all. Back in chapter 1, the inciting incident, some Jews come to stay with Nehemiah in the court of King Artaxerxes. And they talk to him about the people who have already moved back to Jerusalem. They've been involved in the restoration efforts so far. Can you see it? They're not just in trouble because of the lack of a wall. They're not just in fear. Yeah, they're in disgrace. They're in disgrace. In a lot of ways, having a wall is what makes it a city. Having a wall is in these times as maybe Starbucks is today. If you don't have one, you're not really a place, right? The broken wall is not just a practical issue. The broken wall is a source of shame. The broken wall is a reminder that their city is a poor reflection of what it used to be, what it should be. And so it's no wonder that the Hebrew people are not flooding back to Jerusalem. There's practical issues, and it just isn't the draw that it should be. It just doesn't feel like a city. So when Nehemiah sets out to rebuild the wall, it's not just the practical. It's also about making the city of David, the city with the temple of God, the city where God's presence symbolically lived. It's about making that place back into a city. And it's not easy. It's a fascinating book, and I highly recommend it to you. Nehemiah has to get over all kinds of obstacles. He has to persuade Artaxerxes to let him go, take time off from his day job to go and rebuild this wall. He has to find a way to rebuild his wall with a workforce that wasn't a lot more qualified than the one we had earlier. And right from the start, we see these enemies. Not just natural obstacles, but also human obstacles. When our reading starts, we're actually getting close to the end. Nehemiah has overcome everything. He is a man of such prayer, constantly praying, and he overcomes these obstacles. But actually, when you're getting near the end, that can be a dangerous time. I don't know how many of you have been watching Gladiators. For those who haven't seen it, there are male and female contenders. They do a series of athletic challenges against the gladiators, or as I think of them, Legend and some other people. And at the end of the episode, the last thing that they do is they race against each other. The two contenders, they race against each other on an obstacle course. And that's the kind of pinnacle. And the real drama of the episode comes pretty reliably at the very, very end of the obstacle course. The Travelator, a moving walkway going against you. And you have to run up it. The contenders have to run up there. They've spent a whole day being chased around by unfeasibly muscular people in Lycra. They've been scrambling up nets and over jumps on this obstacle course, racing against another human being, and then they've got to run the wrong way up a Travelator. Quite a lot of them find this is just one thing too many. It's actually really not unusual for one contender to get there ages before the other one, and it's just too far. They just can't do it. With their opponent closing in, some of them manage to get up again. Some of them manage to dust themselves off and run back up. Others fall flat on their faces, inches from victory. What we see in our passage this morning is that Nehemiah's opponents know that this project is in its late stages. The clock's ticking down. The finishing line's in sight. The gaps in the wall are being closed up. They're getting ready to rehang the gates, to finish this great project, to make the city a city again. So if they want to stop this happening, it's now or never. And right from the first time we hear about them, Sanballat and Tobiah have been against the wall. Geshem too, we'll come to Geshem. They've done various things, but each time Nehemiah is able to keep it going. So in this chapter, when they have their last chance, they don't attack the work anymore. No. They ramp it up. They attack Nehemiah personally. And after all the challenges he's overcome to get to this point, he has to get over this last hurdle. He has to make it up that travelator and not fall flat on his face. There are 3 different attacks in our passage. Sanballat and Geshem try to distract, they try to dismay, and they try to discredit. So first, verses 1 to 4. Sanballat and Geshem send Nehemiah a message. Come and meet us in a village on the plain of Ono. And actually, if we take that at face value, maybe that's quite a positive thing, right? Maybe that's quite an interesting invitation. Nehemiah knows, they haven't made it a secret, Nehemiah knows that they're behind quite a lot of the problems that he's been having. At one point, they were noising it around that they were going to send people to attack the workers. And so Nehemiah's had to stop half his workforce. At any one time, half of his workforce are standing guard, while the other half are putting bricks on the wall. So actually, if we believe this, if we think that this is a genuine invitation, this is kind of positive, right? We could get everybody back to working. And they seem pretty persistent. Nehemiah refuses to meet them, and they send another invitation, and another, 4 times. The same invitation. But Nehemiah wasn't fooled. Verse 2, Nehemiah saw this wasn't an attempt to bury the hatchet, it was a scheme to harm him. And we're not told exactly how. Some people, here's the map, some people look at the location and they think maybe the plan here was that Nehemiah wasn't going to make it back from the plains of Ono. The green area, you can sort of see the color, the green area is Judah, and that's relatively safe to travel in. Outside of that, it's enemy territory. So Nehemiah would have been going into hostile ground. It would have been very believable if Nehemiah hadn't come back. But other people, and I'm one of these people, look at Nehemiah's reply, and they think that the harm that Nehemiah saw that Sanballat was doing was actually not trying to kill him, but just taking time away from the project. They were trying to hinder him, to harm his work. Because it wasn't like he had, and it wasn't there, the work stopped. And 37 miles, maybe not that much to us, it's about the distance from here to my office, but it would have taken Nehemiah 1 or 2 days. And even on Great Northern, it doesn't take me that long. Everything would have stopped. For 1 or 2 days there, however long the meeting took, and 1 or 2 days back. Either way, Nehemiah wasn't biting. I'm afraid it's actually impossible to preach this passage without making this joke. 4 times they asked Nehemiah to come and meet them on the plains of Ono, and 4 times, you can see it coming, right? 4 times, Nehemiah said, oh no. Actually, he didn't. Actually, he said something so much better. Verse 3. I am carrying on a great project. This is more important. Whatever you're offering, whatever you're suggesting, I am carrying on a great project. So no, why should the work stop while I leave? Sanballat and Geshem have tried to distract Nehemiah, but he refuses to lose focus. His project is too great. So, verse 5, Sanballat tries to dismay Nehemiah and the whole workforce. He sends Nehemiah another letter, and this one says he's heard the wall building project is really just a part of Nehemiah's plan to set him up as a king and lead the Jews as a rebel kingdom. That's what everyone's saying. Oh, and Geshem says it's true, and everybody knows Geshem's unbiased. Why would that be scary? Well, verse 7, this report will get back to the king. And actually, I wonder if you notice, Sanballat is actually making sure that this report will get back to the king. The first 4 letters that were sent were sealed, literally sealed with wax. And the reason you did that was so that the messenger wouldn't read it. You're sending a messenger, again, they're taking days to get to the place where they're getting. They're going to read it if it's not sealed. So you seal it with wax. The fifth letter is an open letter. It's not sealed. That actually meant that the messenger was meant to read it. You knew if you didn't seal your letter, they would read it. They would talk to the people they encountered on their journey, and they would say, oh, I'm carrying a message. What's the message? Oh, I can tell you because it's not sealed. I've read it. It's basically the equivalent of tagging somebody in a tweet or in a message on Discord or whatever. It sort of looks like a message to that person, but you know it's public. You know that everybody else can see the thing that you're allegedly saying to that person. And so it comes off something like this. King Artaxerxes trusted you, Nehemiah. He let you take time off from your job. He gave you power. He gave you resources so that you could go and build this wall, and this is how you repay him. This is what you're doing. You're rebelling against the king. You're rebelling against the Persian Empire. Oof, ballsy move. Well, how does Nehemiah respond? Two things. Again, verse 8, he responds to Sanballat. Nehemiah, you might get the feeling, a fairly blunt individual. Presumably, he sent this on an open letter as well, back up to the same route so that everybody else will see it. They've seen the accusation. They can see the response. No. Nothing like what you're saying is happening. You are making it up out of your head. Fantastic, right? No beating around the bush. Don't give Sanballat the benefit of the doubt. He hasn't really heard a rumor. He's not really trying to help. So why? Why not just be blunt? Why not just respond? But as well as the response, verse 9, Nehemiah does something else. And this really is the key to Nehemiah. He does this throughout the book. He recognizes that the news of this letter will have got around. That's the point. That's why it's an open letter. So even though he can respond bluntly to Sanballat and put him back in his box, he's got to know the seed of doubt's been planted in his workforce. He has to know that they're going to be keeping one eye on the horizon, watching out for King Artaxerxes and his army. It's a huge threat. This is a nuclear level issue. And that's the plan. That's Sanballat's hope. That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to make the workforce feel like, well, what's the point? We can rebuild this wall, but Artaxerxes believes we're a rebel kingdom. He's just going to come and smash it up again. Why would we bother? He's trying to dismay them so that they'll stop working. That's the plan. And that's the need that Nehemiah knows needs to be addressed. And even though he can respond to Sanballat, he can say it's not true, that doesn't solve the problem. What solves the problem? Prayer. Prayer. Verse 9, the enemy is trying to dismay us. The enemy is trying to weaken the hands of the workforce, so you pray, strengthen my hands. Not literally just his hands on the end of his arms, but all the hands that were available to him. All the hands in the workforce. Keep them from being dismayed. Keep them from giving up. Make them strong for the job. Strengthen their hands. So they tried to distract, and Nehemiah kept focus. They tried to dismay, and Nehemiah prayed for courage. Verses 10 to 13, they tried to discredit Nehemiah. This is quite a sneaky one, actually. He goes to see Shemaiah, a prophet, but the prophet's been paid off. The message that Shemaiah gives Nehemiah is that men are coming to kill him, and let's face it, that's pretty believable at this point. They've tried to summon him to go on a dangerous journey, possibly intending to kill him. They spread a rumor that's possibly going to inspire King Artaxerxes to come and invade. It's not that hard to imagine that they might have paid off an assassin, right? I mean, it's entirely possible. But it's okay, Nehemiah, don't worry. Here's the solution. Let's hide from the assassins by going into the temple itself and closing the doors behind us, and we'll be safe in there. Why is that a problem? Doesn't immediately occur to us, did occur to Nehemiah. He's not allowed in the temple because he's not a priest. That's why. And it's actually doubly sneaky because there is a place very near the temple where somebody can go and ask for protection if their life is in danger. They can grab the horns of the altar, it's called. It's a fantastically evocative expression, but it's in the courtyard. It's not in the temple. And that's why the language here is so clear. Let us go inside the temple and close the doors. That's the thing that Shemaiah has said to try and tempt Nehemiah into sin. This teacher, this prophet, is telling Nehemiah something that is very close to the truth, very close to allowed, but not quite. Not quite. And if Nehemiah had done it, he'd have broken God's law. And his enemies immediately would have used that to discredit him, to give him a bad name. How can he have the moral authority to command the workforce of Jerusalem to rebuild the city of David when he himself has committed such a major public sin as to go into the middle of the temple? It just wasn't done. But again, Nehemiah sees what's happening. He understands this. He knows his laws so well that he can see that fine distinction between the courtyard of the temple and inside the temple, and he won't be tempted. Even if he is afraid, he won't be tempted. I will not go. Verse 11. And what doesn't verse 11 say? Well, it doesn't say, but I knew that this wasn't true. I knew there weren't any assassins. That's not there. No, maybe he did believe that there were people coming to kill him. But even so, Nehemiah wouldn't go. He was not the type of man who would put aside God's law, even to save his own skin. So there we have it. Those are the final attempts by Nehemiah's enemies to stop the wall being built. They tried to distract, they tried to dismay, and they tried to discredit, but each time he sees through the scheme. Each time Nehemiah is discerning, each time he prays. And each time he makes sure that his priorities are right, he responds in truth, and he responds directly. It's a brilliant model. And then verse 15. The wall is completed. The gates are rehung. The city of David is a city again. So why is any of this relevant? Why did I want to talk to you about this? I said earlier, building the wall is not just about physical safety. It's also about how the place feels. It's also about it being a proper place, a proper city that is attractive for people to come and live, for God's people to come and live. And that, to me, is about as clear a picture as I can imagine in Old Testament terms of church. Nehemiah's building a church. He's building a place for God's people to come and be God's people. A place that is physically safe, yes, a place that feels like home. He's not just protecting people physically, he's trying to bring more in. He's planting a flag among the nations, and he's saying, this is where God's people are. And that's church. Just like Nehemiah, we're building a place for God's people to come and be God's people. Just like Nehemiah, we're in enemy territory, waving our flag that says God's people are here. And just like Nehemiah, we're going to find out that the world doesn't like that very much. We're going to find opposition, and those attacks might get personal. And when they do, we're going to see this same playbook again and again and again. Distract, dismay, and discredit. It's very unlikely that anything we're doing here or in Baldock is going to lead to a local councillor inviting us to meet them down a dark alley in Stevenage. But it's very likely that people will stall us so that we'll go away. It's very likely that people will offer us something else, something that will distract us from the thing we're really meant to be doing, the thing that God has really put on our hearts. Actually, distractions might come from inside the church too. There are always more things we could do. There are always more ministries we could run. There are always lots of priorities competing for our attention. Or maybe the distractions come from inside. Of course, we're meant to enjoy the world God made for us, but we're also meant to have our priorities in order. Nehemiah shows us focus. He shows us that we need to recognize the distractions. We need to know what in our life is a great work, and that's the work of God. And anything else that tries to take us away from that is not going to do it, not going to distract us. Why should that work cease? I'm carrying on a great project. The world will certainly try to dismay us. There's no shortage of news coverage when church congregations shrink, or the census says that fewer people are reporting themselves as Christian, or a church leader does something wrong. Maybe we'll hold an event and the turnout will be low. Maybe we'll try an initiative within the church and it won't be popular. Whether you're in a role here that faces outwards into the community, or you're in a role that faces inwards within the church, or both, the work can be hard. It can be really hard. And all too often we do get dismayed. We do let it weaken our hands. We do think it's a bit pointless. What can I really do? What can I really change? Well, Nehemiah shows us that when that's going to happen, we should be praying. Strengthen my hands, Lord. Strengthen the people who need strengthening for this work. Not just me, my colleagues, my team, whoever it is that's helping in that ministry. Jesus has more strength than we could possibly need to do anything that we're doing here. And he wants to share it with us. We should be praying for it. And yes, people will try to discredit us, whether that's the outside world telling us we need to get in step with modern views, or maybe a speaker or even a friend who gives us a version of the Bible that's not quite right, but it would make our lives a bit easier. We can be tempted to knuckle under. We can be tempted to do something that's going to make us more acceptable in the eyes of the outside world, or we can be tempted to do something that's going to make our lives a little bit easier within the church. But if it's not what God teaches us in the Bible, then we're going to lose our way. And ultimately, we're not going to be able to do the work that God's prepared us for. Nehemiah shows us we need to be confident in our Bible. We need to know our doctrine. It's an old-fashioned word, but we do. So that we're going to recognize when what we're hearing is not right. When someone's trying to lead us down the wrong path, we need to say, I will not go. It's a lot. I hope you feel challenged this morning. I certainly do. But this is what's called for, as we're playing our role in building God's worldwide church, to stay focused, to stay motivated, and to stay in line with God's will. And that's why Nehemiah is such a man of prayer. And that's why we should all be praying for these things. God has infinitely more strength than we need to do all of these things. And he will help us do it. He will help us to finish our part of his great project. So as we start to respond to God and what he said to us this morning, we're going to sing again. And our last song speaks to us about the God-given strength that helps us to play his part, us the church, to play our part in the plan that God's laid before us. By faith, the mountain will be moved. By prayer, the mountain will be moved. And the power of the gospel will prevail. So please stand we'll give the musicians a second.
By faith we see the